Hello, everyone. This is Ed Breniger, and welcome to the Eddie Network podcast. My guest today is Leesa Tongoulidis. Is that is that it? All right.
Yep. Fantastic.
And she's from Australia. And um, tell us a little bit about yourself and how we met.
Oh, wow. It's always a bit of a wicked weave how you meet people, isn't it, Ed? At least it is for me. I'm always searching high and low for inspiring people that I can learn from and bounce my own thoughts and ideas around the future of work and leadership in particular, which is where I specialize. Um, and so through mutual connections, our lovely friend John Granholm. uh, had the pleasure of connecting with you, Ed, and then that sort of started a nice little curiosity trail of understanding a bit more about you and your background and the sorts of people that you talk to on your podcast. And so here I am, curious, interested, and really excited about sort of this next era of leadership that we're entering, which I feel is a very generative space. Not to say that we don't have issues and challenges and things to work through. But for me, I believe that this is a great time to be alive and a great opportunity to work with leaders around, the crazy stuff that's going on in the world and get people really focused on what's important.
So I'm going to ask you the question I normally ask at the end of the podcast.
Okay.
So where do you get this hope? Because you're expressing hope in the future, and where does this come from?
I've always had it since I was a young child. So if you can imagine somebody, getting a ball, throwing the ball forward, my goal was always to walk towards that ball. And, when I picked it up, I'd just keep throwing it a little bit further and walk towards it again. And that was just my way. That was my curiosity and my appetite for learning, which I've always had. But of course, being in the modern world that we're in, sometimes you have to temper that because you've got to earn a living and raise kids and do things in life. But this insatiable appetite for learning has always been a part of my character. Um, and I've had the good fortune, I suppose, over the last 5, 6 years to really focus on this beast of a problem, which is what does leadership look like post-COVID? What does leadership look like post-digital? All of those sorts of things. So I really spent a lot of time contemplating that, testing things out, and working alongside all of that. But it started off as quite a big passion project of mine, as I'm sure many other people had. But that ball was sort of thrown way, way, way into the future. And I just walk towards it every day. And so I've been learning and picking up things from a whole range of people and just deepening my own uh, range of insight and wisdom over that time. And now I'm sort of at a point where it's sort of come together in a bit more of a collective mass. So it might not be the traditional pathway that a lot of people learn, but that's how I learn. And so for me, it's been a thrill and an honor. It's been scary and difficult and terrifying at times,
Yeah.
but in my view, that's how we learn. Step
Is
into the ring with the ugly frog.
are the are the questions of leadership in Australia different than what they are, say, in other parts of the world?
Well, I thought so. And that was sort of part of my inquiry in terms of finding and connecting with people overseas. Fundamentally, I don't think humans are all that different. Their
Mhm.
circumstances are different, the conditions in which they operate in are different, the political landscapes are different. But fundamentally, I think there's a great amount of fear around the future. And I'm someone who feels the fear and does it anyway, sometimes rather difficultly. I wouldn't say I'm a master at managing my own fear, but I err on the side of, stepping into the ring with the ugly frog because I kind of figure, well, what's the worst that could happen? let's just go and have a look and see what we see and what we hear, and then we can respond or dismiss it. So there's a lot of sifting going on, as you would expect, I guess, integrating things, debunking things, sort of finding what feels right, not just for myself, but for the clients that I work with. And so I really mobilized my research and efforts around complexity and uncertainty because it's an area that I feel very comfortable with. And I know it's an area that most people don't feel comfortable with. So I'm sort of sitting on the opposite side of a two-way mirror there. But it's a good thing because that's what I do. I help people work through complexity and uncertainty. And most of all, it's really focused around enabling leaders to kind of get past themselves and to start taking a more systemic or systems view of the world and to see themselves part of the system. That's a big leap for most leaders globally, I think, because we've been a very self-centered, species for quite some time. And it's just not easy to detach from the self and think more holistically about leadership. And sometimes it's sort of seen as a bit of a nice to have. But my sense is, this is what I'm sensing into, is that it's not a nice to have anymore. It's a critical aspect of being a leader in the 21st century. So I'm kind of glad that I rode the waves of complexity and uncertainty all my life. I thought one day this will serve me well, and here I am. So, I'm quite joyful actually, not because we have this problem to solve, but I do feel like I'm one of many fabulous people around the world that I've met who are spearheading this, who are tackling it, who are knocking the edges off it and getting to the heart of what needs to happen. And it's poetry in motion. I think we're in the middle of it. So it's the most stickiest, most tangled part of it, which I kind of like, to be honest. But my goal is always to get people through it.
Do you find that people can articulate what complexity looks like in their life or in their business? Do you
Good
have to help
question.
them, or do you have to help them articulate that?
Mm, I think it shows up differently everywhere you go. It's a bit like asking someone, how do you do anxiety? It's very different for everyone. Some people withdraw, some people go for a run, some people tear down a building, some people go out and buy a new wardrobe, some people go and annoy people. Complexity is somewhat in that realm. My sense is that everyone has a different angle on it, and it's context dependent because once we start talking about complexity, we are starting to talk about more than just ourselves. It's the relationships that we have with people, with things, with institutions, with power. And so, when I do meet someone who's working through complexity and uncertainty, it doesn't always look the same, but my feel is that the the things that are underpinning it are the same. So, we're much, much more aware of global circumstances and the political landscapes and just trying to figure out the dynamic in which we're moving through in this last 10, 20 years. It's been so fast. Some people have not been able to catch their breath in that period of time. I've had my moments as well, but I'm like, you've got to stop, you've got to recalibrate, you've got to think about the bigger picture, at least I do, from the point of view of your kids, your grandkids. So I'm very much into not just sustainability for the sake of sustainability. It's got to work for many, many people. So there's no one solution, but I think there's lots of mini solutions based on the context and the impact that those sectors or those people have. And that's what makes the work so interesting because every time I work with a different leader or a different organization, we face different challenges together, and so we're learning together. And for me, that's the best kind of learning because it's not about me being the expert. It's about holding the space for the learning to happen and to get the trust and the conversation going.
Are there, and I'm not sure how to ask this question, but are there things, whatever a thing is, that um, are often or always showing up when you enter into this kind of discussion or this kind of work? What is, and and maybe let me be more specific. The, where is the conflict internal to the person, or is it external within how they have structured their life and their work and their businesses and their families, and which seems to be the more difficult to address? That's not the same question as I started with, but I think it's really what I'm interested
No,
in.
no, no, I hear what you're saying. Well, I
So
think the hardest thing to do is to change yourself.
yeah,
Th this is all the quiet, unspoken aspects of complexity and uncertainty. We've done a pretty good job, I think, in terms of externalizing complexity and building some amazing processes and systems and ways of working that keep the engine running with a high degree of precision and understanding and respecting complexity. But the people who are behind the scenes haven't necessarily kept are not in lockstep with that because we've almost outsourced our authority to the institution, to the system. And so when I see this mass response of, we've got to fix the system, we've got to fix the system, you know, that's where I get alarm bells ringing in my head because I'm thinking, well, you know what? You're actually part of the system. And how about looking at yourself in relationships with the system? And so it's like, oh, you want me to play that game? I want to point the finger and blame somebody.
yeah,
And we're pretty good at doing that. And not to say that I think systems and, uh, you know, organizations could be designed and recreated in a much more human way. I think we're well on the way to doing that. But it's almost like people outsource the problem and think of it as somewhere else. And to some degree, up until more recent times, I think that's somewhat valid because it was just the way society was structured, very hierarchical. And so it made it easy for people to point the finger or to point blame and things like that. And so the discussions would always be around how we could fix the system. And, I'm not going to be a part of that because it's not a system that I agree with, which is absolutely fine. But then you kind of got to look a good look at yourself in the mirror and say, who am I? Who am I in relation to whatever's going on in the world? Am I going to be the person who withdraws and just waits to see what happens? Am I going to be the maverick who, puts their hand up and says, oh, I know all the answers? Or are you going to stay in that messy middle and figure it out? And that's really an exhausting process for a lot of people, especially if you don't have a scaffold or a system or a framework or someone who can walk with you. And so that's kind of what I do. And to me, that's one of the most joyful things I can do as a human being, rather than telling people I've got it all sorted, because I certainly haven't, but to co-create, to work with people on thinking about themselves in relation to the work that they're doing. That's where I see the biggest uplift in what I do. I'm not sure if I answered the question though.
yeah. Well, yeah, I think you have, and it leads to the question for me, which is, how did you find yourself doing this?
Very organic, very organic. So I do not come from the academic field, and I saw that as a bit of a chip on my shoulder in my earlier years, because it just wasn't a fit for me in terms of the way I learn. I'm very much tactile, kinesthetic, need to be in in amongst it all. That's how I learn, just through touch and sensing. And so it kind of maybe it was a bit of a self-imposed limitation I put on myself, but I kind of felt like I didn't have a place, in organizations for quite some time because of that. And so I was always looking for answers in the realm of science and academia. And at the same time, I have a great love and interest in so many things. I just wasn't buying that that was the full picture. So my curious self had to go out and learn the hard way, as I did. And I just put myself in really challenging and difficult situations because I was curious and I wanted to see what was under the hood. I wanted to learn in the field, and that's definitely been the strongest and most powerful way I've learned. And that's not to say I dismiss other avenues of learning, but I think we're actually in an era now where that type of experience, the value of it has increased exponentially because I've walked in those places where a lot of people wouldn't have. And so that's I suppose an edge that I bring to this work and just having that big wide radar.
Is this Does this mean that this qualifies you as a polymath?
Well, it's not a term I was very comfortable with, I have to say. But
But
yes, I would call myself a polymath. Mostly because I attributed that term to people like Leonardo da Vinci and various
Mhm.
others. And so I was thinking, well, I can't
Well,
possibly
I
be in
agree.
that
Yeah,
category of person.
I'm in the
But
same
I
boat.
used to think to myself, yeah, so I kind of had a bit of an ick factor. That's what we say in Australia. It feels a bit icky. But the more I connect with polymaths and people who think like polymaths, the more I'm getting comfortable with it. And I suppose it's like anything. If the situation doesn't call for polymath thinking, which I think in many cases in organizations and institutions has not been a requirement up until recently. It stayed in academia, it stayed in science, in all of those lovely little pockets, which I find enormously interesting to follow, and I do. But when it comes to organizational structure, there were tried and tested models, methods, and we didn't really need to go down that path. So it wasn't a subject for discussion, and agency, personal agency, was vested in the institution and the CEO and the leadership team. So I could show up for work and I didn't really have to invest
Right.
myself. And that's given people a great opportunity to just be towed along by the system rather than to work interactively with it.
See, the I think we're going through the a metamorphosis related to all kinds of terms that we've
Mm,
applied to ourselves. One of those is polymath. My, you know, you're in connection with Barbara Cleve and Barbara had reached out to me about 3 years ago, right as I was starting the podcast, and she told me that she thought I was a polymath, and I went, "What?" Because my perception was a polymath is someone who's got two or three PhDs from three different disciplines. And she said, "No, no, no. It's all about your desire to learn." And now this is where I'm interested in this concept. We don't have to use the word polymath, but we're going to use it here as a aspect of the development of leaders. So I see that polymathy is, as Barbara has defined it for many of us, a mindset of many learnings. We're open
mm,
to learning from many different sources, many different fields. And I totally agree with that. But what if that polymathy is not something that's primarily of the intellect or of the personality, but rather something that we do as a behavior. That is something we actually seek to do, and we approach every situation. Okay, I'm going to go learn and see what I need to know from things I don't know anything about in this instance. And that if leaders were to become curious and go searching for answers rather than assuming they already have the answers, we would see a very different set of things happening in organizations today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's an orientation, I think, and an orientation when it's educated and given the space and the permission is something that people can adopt. So there's a space of education and uplift that I think needs to permeate, all areas of society. So that's one of the exciting things about doing this work is that it's not just a hard slog for me or people like yourself who can see that future. It's got to come through, the system. It's got to come through educational pathways. It's got to shift the way institutions are designed and operate. And that is a massive, massive beast
Yeah.
to do. But I feel like the work is endless, but there's no, I mean, there's critical urgency in some sectors, which, I work in health and education and government. I feel like that's usually the first part of society that responds to these generational shifts, and then business sometimes follows on. Sometimes it's the other way around. But there's many, many good people doing that work. And I suspect that polymath and, and polymathy will be a much more commonly used term, um, perhaps in our own lifetime. I'd love to see that because I just think there's no greater joy than learning. But that's my personal angle. Not everybody feels that way.
What did you study in college? What was your major area? What was your
Human
degree?
resources,
Huh?
human resources and training and development.
And how did you come to choose that? What was that path towards that decision as to what you studied?
Because I love people, love talking to people, have very strong interpersonal and intrapersonal skills. It just felt like the right place for me to shine in an organization. And it gave me a lot of license to create. And I couldn't be in a role in an organization if I wasn't creating or getting up to a bit of mischief or being a bit of a provocateur. And of course, there's an operational side to HR, and I've definitely done my baptism of fire in that space. Um, but where I kind of was drawn into was organizational development and the design of work and working more closely with leadership teams in a variety of um, sectors, and that was always part of the design. I didn't want to stay anywhere and be safe. I was curious. I was like, so how does leadership work here? And what about over there? And what about in that sector? So there was always a drive to pick that kit bag up and then go and play and test it in different environments with different groups. One, just because it kept me interested, but also, I wanted to understand the breadth of how leadership looks in Australia, particularly, and I've done a few other things overseas, but that was the drive behind it. So it's always been a people thing for me, and even with the advent of AI and digitization, I think people and leadership is it's the perfect time to upgrade, level up, level in, whatever it looks like for your particular situation. But there's resistance to it because we're trying to implement systems and solutions when in actual fact we have to do a bit of work on ourselves. We can't just throw it towards AI and pray and hope that it all gets sorted. I mean, it will, but we don't want to be left behind in that era.
So
That's my theory.
So when did you make the transition out of what you were doing as a an HR person to becoming a consultant or coach or whatever terminology you're using to what you're doing today? When did that take
Yeah.
place, and what was it that led you there?
I would say it's been a slow burn for me, and probably because, I was working through my own self-awareness, my own leadership skills. But over, I think it was about 11 years ago, I had a quite a lot of friction between myself and the leader that I was working with. And I was moralistically divided about staying in corporate and leaving it. But, you have to feed the family, don't you, Ed? So I sort of had one foot in, one foot out, and I was starting to contract more and consult rather than sort of looking for permanent work because I wanted to keep that arm's length distance. I wanted to know that I had an out if I needed it, and
Yeah,
I didn't want to become so dependent on my corporate career because I thought that was a danger to my ability to think freely and to go and source my own thoughts. So I did that for about 5 or 6 years, and then just before COVID, I had some medical episodes. So I had a stroke, so that will knock you down.
wow,
Um, so it was very, very tough. It was 2 months just before COVID, but I also had a heart condition and I had pneumonia, and Australia was going through the worst bushfire season, I think, on record. So it was in this very, very intense period of time in my life, and then COVID came along, that I said to myself, well, it's now or never. You can't sit on the edges and just be looking and figuring stuff out. You've got to throw yourself into it. And so, rightly or wrongly, I was terrified when COVID hit, but I was also excited at the same time because I knew it meant change. And I knew it meant that potentially I could lean in to my work a lot more closely, which I did. And I'm so pleased that I did that. There's many inflection points along the way where I doubted myself. But now I'm surrounded by, incredible mentors, coaches, leaders. It's been hard, but I feel like I'm in the wave of people globally who really want to make a difference in the leadership space. And that is a great source of comfort, it's a great source of learning. It's fast, you don't have to just anchor yourself into whatever's going on in your business. I can reach out far and wide and synthesize that knowledge and insight and then start applying it real time, and that's exciting. I can't wait for the next academic model or paper to come out. It's got to be dynamic, it's got to be multifaceted. And that's the space, I suppose, that I I I, I play in. It's an interpreter of all of that wonderful work that's happened in the past and is happening now, and then applying it real time, getting down and dirty with leaders in the middle of their crisis, in the middle of their challenges, and helping them to reorient to what's real, what's
hmm
necessary, what's required in this moment.
you recently, correct me if I'm wrong, you recently started writing on Substack. Is that right? Or has that been on for a while?
I'm not, well, writing hasn't been one of my areas of comfort, but I have been practicing, I would say, over the last 12 to 18 months. So instead of reacting, I started to put my own thoughts and views out there. And it's like anything, it's going to be pretty crappy when you first start, but I feel like, off the back of working with people like yourself and many others, I'm getting my L plates and working on it. So it's definitely a passion, but it's something I'm growing into as my writing.
What do you feel that, what is it that when someone reads something you've written, what do you want them to do with that?
Hmm. I think that my goal is for them to see some aspect of themselves in it.
Uh-huh.
And I draw that thinking from art because I have a really, really strong passion for all things art. And I do believe, whenever we're sort of in a Renaissance period, which we sort of are now, which we are, we often look to art as a comfort, as a guide. It might be a little bit ambiguous, but there's usually something quite generative about art. Um, and whether it's writing, poetry, a piece of art, if you can see an element of yourself in it, it
Hmm.
might be that internal nudge for you to kind of start thinking, oh, maybe I should shift, maybe I should think about that more. So it's not going to be big and brassy, my writing, because I really like to work with the undercurrent that's going on. And I think that undercurrent sits inside us. It's not out there. It's
Yeah.
us trying to make sense of this crazy world. And so, I've tried to make sense of this crazy world with my own experiences. And I want to invite people in to do the same. It's going to be a different experience for them. Of course, we're all different. But if we just kind of open ourselves up to a little bit more curiosity, it kind of begets more curiosity. And curiosity on its own isn't going to solve problems, but it will lift us up and out of this state of worry and fear, which I think is holding us back as leaders and just people in general.
Do you see a book coming out of all this?
Oh, most definitely. I've got three, I've got three on the boil.
Oh, good. Oh,
So
good.
this year is me writing my book, yes. So it's going to be a reflection of everything I've learned over the last 5 and 6 years,
Well,
5 or 6 years.
when your book comes out, then I want you to come back and we'll talk about it.
Definitely, we will do that.
It-
Yeah.
And is it a leadership book or is it more an arts book of like poetry or essays, of thoughtful essays
All of the above.
oh boy.
My
Well,
my my first book is leadership, so it's leadership beyond survival is the theme
what
because I think we've got to get ourselves out of that survival state.
do you have a definition of leadership?
I wouldn't say I have a definition. I think it all depends. It really all depends on what's needed in a given context. But fundamentally, I think if we're leading with curiosity and a generative spirit within ourselves, it's not to say that fear and worry and all that goes away, but we can't get the clarity that we need to navigate all of this complexity unless we're on the right side of the ledger, which is about life and, future generations. If there'll be definitely leadership that's there to dismantle what was and what's no longer needed, and there'll be people who are extracting the good stuff from all of that. So I don't want that leadership to go away. But the leadership that I'm sort of aligned to mostly is about that generative thought process. So creative intelligence leads to more creative intelligence, whereas fear-based leadership leads to more fear-based leadership. So it's a pretty simple logic. And so my drive, my push is to get people to think um, both, in a linear way, a non-linear way, that they both belong. It's just a question of the recipe that you need for your organization. We've probably done pretty well to this point with linear style of leadership, but now it's time to furnish and accommodate non-linear ways of thinking, non-linear ways of being, because that's where I think we're going to crack open some really, really amazing talent, amazing solutions. It's how we're going to accelerate leadership. We can't just keep, it's, the old adage, you can't keep solving, the same problems with the same knowledge or technology. You've got to be doing something different. So I don't want it. I felt like it was a bit of a fad, but then I tested it and tested it and tested and tested it, and I went, this is not a fad. This is real, and it's the time to be doing it. So hopefully that kind of gives you a bit of color.
Yes, it does. This is going to be my last question. And I've had a number of conversations in the last during the last month. Let's just put it in that kind of framework where people say are telling me that they feel like something significant has changed. I ask, what do you think it is? And they either say, I don't know, but I feel it, or they say, I don't know, but it seems like people are more open. So what do you have that same sense? And
Mm,
if you do, where do you see this as maybe a I don't want to say a movement because that has kind of people gathering together and joining and doing stuff, but there's some kind of motion happening. And where would you like to see this time next year if we were to gather and to have a conversation in early February next year? Where would you like to see
mm.
this next year progress?
For me, I think it's getting it on the table and having conversations and pulling this way of thinking into our present day reality. And I think, the shifts there they can be quite small when things happen, and there's many people who are sort of early on to that process. But if it was a mainstream conversation in CEO circles and boards that this was a real thing and we need to start orientating ourselves to this type of leadership, I think that would be my most realistic outcome. Of course, I'd love to see it much further embedded, but change takes time, and people, I think, have to come at it with their own sense of truth. And that's the problem that we have now is, I think people are going through similar to what I was, one foot in one camp, one foot in the other. And for those who work in the space, of course, you're much more attuned to those shifts than people who are outside of it or
Hmm.
working in specialist
Yeah.
roles. But if you think about leadership as a collective, if you're in the leadership space and you haven't picked up on that thread, and you're still going out with older models of leadership, again, there's a bit of a sunset on all of that stuff. I'm not saying we should throw it out, but there's definitely a tipping point, and I think we're at it. But to take that tipping point and start having robust conversations with decision makers in government, boards, executive teams, it's about time because there's a ton of noise out there, I think, Ed, and there has been periodically about, whether it's this or that. I'm not saying that they were fads, but they were sort of building blocks to where we are now. And now the house is built and we've got to live in it. So do we want to make some alterations to that? Maybe. Maybe we do because our landscape's changed, our environment's changed, our stimulus has changed. There's a different concern that's rising up, I think, in people individually and collectively about things like the future, the planet. There's an existential thread, I think, that sits underneath it all. At least it does from where I view leadership.
It seems to me that as I've listened to people tell me that they feel like something's taking place, and without knowing what that is, it seems to me that a lot of this is coming out of the emergence of conversation groups online. You and I are
Mm,
part of one that
yep.
John Granholm created. And I think that these are very important um, because they're kind of underwhelming. and yet they're very nurturing of a sense of companionship and colleagueship that we all need and don't find in the institutional structures that exist. And that the more we have conversation, and I don't think we actually know that well what constitutes a sustainable conversation, because it's not the method of talking, it's something other than that, that I think we still have to figure out.
Oh, most definitely. I almost see those groups as little incubators, and
Yeah.
I'm in quite a few of them, as I'm sure you are. And I said to John the other day, I said, how many other people in the world are doing exactly what we're doing right now? Isn't that exciting? Because of course they are. We're not precious, we're not special. There's many, many people doing this work, and that's what makes me feel so excited and energized. But we've all got to keep our heads on straight because we've got a world to run, we've got a business to run, we've got all those things to do. And there's a lovely stabilizing force in those little incubators. And I think each and every one of the people that I've met through that are doing very similar work to me. They're working in a small way, uh, looking for big marketers in terms of change. It's just like, let's go to where we best align our background, our skills, our experiences, our ways of working, and go and tackle this beast, as it were, knowing that you've got all of this wonderful, uh, huge range of intellect and capability sitting behind you. Because when you think that way, of course, you look for it. And so the clients that I've worked with, I see I see that in myself and I see it in them. So we've got this sense of reciprocity of, you need me, I need you. Let's work together on this. And that's a huge shift in trust structures. Um, but when you get invited into that space, it's not about the money or the prestige or the kudos or even being part of a movement. It's just saying, this small part of the world, I can do something that is positive. I can do something that's generative. I can bring something of myself into that space and lift a group of leaders up. If that's all I do in my life, I will be a very happy woman. Of course, I'd love to see it ripple out further, but I've very much had to wrestle with the idea of, you can't save the world, Leesa. There's a lot of bleeding hearts out there saying, if only
I
the world
see,
was like this. My pace is with that. And I'm not in that space anymore. I'm just like, let's do what we can do with what we've got.
I see
Because
that
I know that the rest of it will take place.
what's emerging
Mm,
in our relationships will be the next era of what institutions will look like. And that the current era, which is all predicated upon the Industrial Revolution, will go away because it doesn't work. It worked as it was designed to work, but we're living in a very different
mm,
world. And so something more communal, more relational, more human-based will emerge as a way to organize work and organize enterprises, organize communities. And I don't think we know what that looks like at this point. In fact, I think we're at a kind of transition in human history that we haven't seen in many millennia, because I think what is happening is that the old hierarchies of structure are no longer working. And now, us having conversation, us being supportive and interested and in, in communication and collaboration of, okay, let's do this together. How do we make this work? I think that's the seedbed for something that's going to grow into something that we've never seen before.
Yeah, I agree totally. It's only when you're in the midst of it and you're brave enough to spread your wings far enough to sense into it so that you can pull it into your own reality. And I think that's what holds a lot of people back.
Yeah,
We've attached ourselves to single sources of truth, whether it be a person, an ideology, a philosophy, or whatever it might be. And I think that's how I practice polymathy in the sense that, I keep the net really, really wide. I bring my own personal interest into it. And then I pull those insights and thoughts into my work as a leadership coach or a leadership advisor. And I wrestle with them, in my own time, in my own ways, my very own creative sand pit. And then I test those hypotheses and then I experiment with them. And it's not a forceful process, it's a very gentle process because that sort of change is intrinsic. It's a bottom-up way of working, but at some point traction has to naturally come and take the many experiments that everyone's doing now. It's going to shift it to um, more of the top down, which is the fight that we've got going on now. It's this wrestling match between bottom up and top down structures. It's like, well, we need both. Let's
yeah,
make room for
we
both.
do.
And if we had that, we might find a bit more balance in ourselves and each other. So that's kind of the dream. But to me, that's just based on nature. That's just based on biology and physics. So why wouldn't you want to be in harmony with yourself, with others? I
I
know there's
totally
many
agree.
people who get very rich not having that. But if that was a goal and organizing principles were around that, I think we've got enough smarts in the world to figure it out. I really
Yeah, and I
do.
don't think it's proven that it makes people happy.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you've got to keep a little bit of fire in the belly,
Yeah,
it's no
well,
perfect world.
I mean, you got to pay the rent, you got to feed your family, you got to do all that. But that's not what we're talking about. It's something on a
Mm,
very different scale,
yeah.
but I don't think it breeds happiness. In fact, I think it's a traumatic response to the lack of happiness. And
Yeah.
but that's really a conversation for another time because I think we have talked about a positive view of leadership as this thing that's within us. Um, but there's another side to that as well that
Oh,
we could
absolutely.
we could have another conversation, and maybe we should, in a month or two, have another conversation about that because I think people are interested in this kind of stuff.
Yeah, we can absolutely do that.
Or when your book comes
the
out.
work that I've done. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I would love to do that with you, Ed. It's been so awesome talking with you. And I would just say one thing is that my love for wicked problems and challenging problems was what brought me to this place. It's what brought you and I together to have this conversation. So flipping my own script from looking at everything as a problem statement to an opportunity statement has been that arc. And I think that's the space that we're all kind of shifting between.
I agree.
Is it a problem? Yes, it is. Is it an opportunity? Yes, it is. Can we manage that paradox at the same time? I think we can if we invest in our people, most definitely. And your thought leadership around the future of work and, teasing out those threads historically around where things have worked, not worked, is so, so valuable. And for people of my generation, your generation, and the generations who come after us, will be, I think they have an appetite. I think they have a stronger appetite for this stuff. So bring it on. I would love to share your podcast and more, with my colleagues here in Australia. I think there's many, many lessons we can learn
I'm honored. And that's
from listening to one another. So
thank you.
thank you so much, Ed.
And thank you all for watching. I hope you find encouragement and realization that whatever you feel is holding you back doesn't have to. That there is something within
Yeah,
you
that's
that
great.
if you connect to that will allow you to seek new things, find new places, and discover that your life matters right where you live, right where you work, right within the circle of family and friends that you have. And I wish that for you. And I know Lisa does too. And we are here to encourage that, but also when we can, we will help you make that move forward in the work that you do. So thank you for watching the Eddie Network podcast, and we'll see you next time. Bye bye.